U.S. President Donald Trump has sparked a fresh diplomatic tension after declaring that South Africa should no longer be part of the G20. He accused the country of discriminating against white minorities and announced he would skip the upcoming G20 summit in Johannesburg, sending Vice President JD Vance in his place. Pretoria has downplayed the criticism, insisting it remains ready to host a successful summit. Still, Trump's comments have strained ties with President Cyril Ramaphosa and raised questions about unity within the global economic bloc. So at this time, we're joined by Andile Zulu, Energy Democracy Program Officer at the Alternative Information and Development Center. Thank you so much, Andile, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and hello to your guests.
Yeah, you're welcome. So with anger over land expropriation laws, alleged mistreatment of some groups in South Africa, the disapproval of South Africa's foreign policy, is there any justification to Trump's hostility towards South Africa?
I would say, although President Trump probably thinks differently, I don't think there is much justification. We should first clarify that the accusation that white South Africans are being directly persecuted is a complete myth and a part of the conspiracy theory that's quite popular amongst white nationalists globally and racists domestically here in South Africa, the conspiracy of white genocide, the idea that the majority black government for the past 30 years or so has been either planning or subtly executing a systematic cleansing or killing or persecution of white South Africans. And that simply isn't true. Looking at empirical data, it's quite clear that the vast majority of white South Africans enjoy a better quality of life in terms of access to job opportunities, in terms of their low levels of unemployment and their low levels of poverty, in terms of access to medical insurance, and also access to some of the safest and I'd say most prosperous communities across the country. So this is a complete fabrication that the president has been brought into, but one that is expected by an administration that embraces features of American white nationalism. And secondly, in terms of the expropriation, the issues with expropriation, what essentially happened was that there was an adjustment, a legislative reform to the expropriation laws, which have been on the books since the 1970s, and it added a new criteria through which property can be expropriated by the states for the public good or for the public benefits and purpose. But most legal scholars and most South Africans know that you aren't going to arrive at a situation where the state excessively wields its power to take away property from white South Africans or from really any South Africans at all. Even the distribution of land, unfortunately, is still quite unequal in South Africa. 30 years after we achieved representative democracy, the vast majority of property still exists within the hands of the wealthy and within the hands of wealthy white South Africans. So it was a legislative reform that is a long time coming, but it's a legislative reform that isn't likely to have a significant impact on land distribution.
Okay, so I can understand the part where you would, infer that President Trump might have goofed with the white genocide claims. But then when one of the world's biggest economies publicly calls for a G20 members' removal, doesn't that question the group's unity and purpose?
I mean, look, firstly, it's a good question because it makes us remember that membership in the G20, there's no process for removing members of the G20. The G20 does not produce treaties, the resolutions are not binding. It's very different to other international organizations such as say, for example, the United Nations or organizations which belong to the International Court of Justice. But it does demonstrate that global relations are changing significantly to what they have been for the past 50 years of the global economic order since the arrival of, for example, the Washington Consensus in the 90s, Trump's actions and the actions of many other states within the G20, the rise of trade protectionism. I think we're beginning to see an evolving relationship between states, and we're on the precipice of something new when it comes to global relations as a result of many developments that have been happening as far back as the 2008 financial crisis, due to the COVID pandemic, the Ukraine war, the rise of China as a global superpower, the demise, or rather the gradual loss of America's power as a global superpower as well.
All right. So while we're not too sure about whether or not South Africa can be removed from the G20, because of course, like you said, it's by a consensus, and we are not also sure about what economic damage that might do to the country. Let's just track back and look at the situation with Russia that was expelled from the G20 after annexing Crimea. Yet consensus failed to remove the country from the G20 after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But then with Trump's remarks coming now against South Africa, are we not looking at the possibility of division between the G20, because we know that interests will be polarized at this point?
I think the tensions already exist based on international events for the past 5 years. I think Russia's actions in the Ukraine, the increasing dominance and influence of China economically, particularly now that China is one of the most, if the not most significant trading partner for many African countries as well. The rush by Western nations for what are so-called green critical minerals, or critical minerals, minerals being that minerals that are vital to the development of renewable energy as the climate crisis looms on the horizon. So I think the divisions that you would see amongst states are the kinds of divisions that have already been developing or blossoming for the past few years. But what I also see is a lot of frustration with the United States and a lot of realignment from the global powers, especially the economic powerhouses in Southeast Asia and particularly the industrial powers in Europe. So, for example, you see the European Union pivoting towards South Africa increasingly, and us pivoting towards them to establish not only to receive climate finance, to receive developmental finance, but also for us to be able to establish and strengthen new relations. China is also looking for many partners across the continent as well. Then there's also the frustration that the US has had with the BRICS countries and the attempt to get a kind of monetary sovereignty separate from the domination of the US dollar. So these divisions exist, but I think it's also important for us to remember that in as much as there are divisions with policymakers and people within government, the interests of those who are the owners of private capital, who are the owners of mega corporations, of giant investment firms, there's also a question of where their interests lie. Because I think policymakers don't make the decisions that they do, especially when it comes to economic policy and trade, separate from the considerations of their respective private sectors.
Yeah, and we know that the G20 is all about global economic stability, and that will be very, very important for Ramaphosa's administration in terms of the country's economy. So I'd like to find out, do you think that South Africa can actually host a successful G20 summit despite Trump's withdrawal and public criticism? Because, of course, we understand that South Africa is part of the BRICS, right? Just as you've said, has some strong ties with China and Russia. But in terms of this particular summit and its economic strength, do you think it can still pull through despite Trump's rhetorics and jabs?
I think the summit will proceed. And I think many nations that are a part of G20 are aware that the US administration, to put it mildly, takes erratic decisions and makes erratic pronouncements, and is not necessarily committed to the truth or realistically what's going on in South Africa. But again, it's not just about the politics of the respective G20 leaders. It's also about the economic interests of their countries. What are their national interests and what are their economic interests? And in the pursuit of what, sort of financial elites would perceive as, global economic stability, there's a reason to try and cooperate. There's a reason to try and mitigate the economic downturn that's been unfolding since COVID. And to mitigate the economic downturn that's been really continuing since 2008 in both the developed and the so-called developing world. So I think it's still going to proceed regardless of Trump's pronouncements, because I mean, as far as I'm aware, I think he was initially referring to South America. But then, said South Africa because he referred to Floridians, people from Miami running away from South African communism, and we've never had a South African communist government, and we, as far as I'm aware, we don't have many people in Miami who are from South Africa. So I think even that is an indication that the Trump administration's pronouncements shouldn't be taken as face value.
And we still see these pronouncements or these statements coming from Trump as being harsh, most especially on the fact that the U.S., increased tariff against South Africa's exports to the U.S. by about 30%. So I'm actually particularly worried about how that will affect South Africa's trade and its economy too.
So, I mean, those tariffs, I think, are a big indication, firstly, of two things. Firstly, the U.S. administration and Trump's issue with South Africa was not only this myth of white genocide or systemic white persecution. The other problem, of course, was our support and solidarity in our legal case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. And as you know, Israel is a strategic and vital partner for the United States. So, these tariffs, not just for South Africa, but for many countries, was an agenda being advanced by the U.S. from our perspective to firstly boost their industrial base, because the United States has been going through, like many countries around the world, has been going through decades of deindustrialization due to the liberalization of the global financial economy and the fact that now private companies were able to operate on a transnational and multinational basis. And so they fled the US looking for places where it was cheaper to manufacture goods, where it was cheaper to be able to get labor as well. And so the US, like South Africa, has been suffering from deindustrialization. These tariffs are an attempt to sort of re-strengthen their industrial base, but also it's an attempt to control the flow and extraction of critical minerals, which are going to become quite important in the next few decades. And what this indicated to us is that South Africa needs a new developmental path that breaks a exploitative dependency on the West, in particular on the United States, a dependency that's exploitative in terms of us having an export-led economy that produces many things that are consumed somewhere else or that are processed in other countries, which we then buy back for even a higher price while we're not able to employ and feed our own people.
All right. Interestingly, we see the fact that U.S. will be taking the baton from South Africa as it will be hosting the next G20 summit. So just in about a minute, Andile, can both presidents ever find a common ground amid this diplomatic standoff?
It's a difficult question. I think that the South African government has already begun to pivot away from a dependency and a submission to the financial and national and economic interests of the U.S. and those who run its economy. However, I think it's also about the people who run our economies finding what's mutually beneficial for them. The mining corporations, the financing sector, etc. But I think what's most important for South Africans and Africans in general is that we need to chart our own development path. One that allows us to reindustrialize, one that allows us to build the kinds of infrastructure that we need to serve people's needs, one that allows us to also adopt the kinds of renewable technologies that will be able to help us adapt to climate change and those crises. So in as much as the South African government may have difficulty with next year's, with the Trump administration, I think many people like myself in civil society and ordinary South Africans are thinking, how can we reform trade relations and our domestic economy to ensure that we have the kind of stability that will lead us down a path of sustainable development that actually deals with our problems.
Of course, important. Now, Andile Zulu, Energy Democracy Program Officer at the Alternative Information and Development Center, thank you so much for your time on the show.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.